The whispers, the doubts, the small betrayals wrapped in friendly tones. They built the game around your fall, crafted it like architects of collapse. They bet on your breakdown because they confused your quiet with fragility, mistook your slowness for hesitation. To them, you were always just one push away from snapping. But you didn't crack. You studied the cracks in their logic instead. You didn't scream. You stared. You didn't shatter. You shifted. And before they realized what you were really made of, the game was in flames, and you were standing in the smoke, untouched. They played by a script. Push, provoke, corner, control. That's how it's always worked for them. People fold, people flinch, people beg. And when you didn't, they panicked. You were never supposed to stay standing that long. You were supposed to fall into their rhythm, collapse into their conditioning. They'd crafted a role for you. You were supposed to wear it. Be the weak one, the predictable one, the reactive one, the one who gets tired and caves. But you rewrote your role mid-scene, changed your lines, burned the script. You didn't just survive the game, they lost track of it entirely. Because when someone stops playing by the rules of control, manipulation, and emotional baiting, the whole illusion breaks, and you broke it with style. They expected pressure to expose your fractures, not your fire. But you didn't bend, you built. Every sneer they threw, you absorbed. Every doubt they muttered, you converted into drive. While they mocked you, you maneuvered. While they slept on you, you studied them, their moves, their patterns, their triggers. You became fluent in their falsehood, and you waited for your moment, not to attack, but to evolve beyond their reach. That's the secret no one tells you about real power. It doesn't retaliate, it outgrows. And you didn't just win, you rendered their rules irrelevant. You made the game itself obsolete. They thought you were playing to survive, but you weren't. You were decoding. You were watching the puppet show from behind the curtain. And once you saw the strings, you stopped reacting to the puppet. You stopped wasting your breath trying to change players who only knew how to cheat. You chose a different approach. Sabotage the board. Remove your consent. And that's what broke them. Not your strength, but your refusal to keep engaging. They don't fear being beaten. They fear becoming invisible to someone who used to hang on their every move. And you gave them that fear, served it cold, wrapped in silence and clarity. You didn't fight back in the way they expected. That's what drove them mad. You didn't shout, accuse, explain, or plead. You simply evolved. You switched languages, started speaking in decisions, not emotions, in boundaries, not apologies. You became fluent in detachment. You stopped performing for their approval and started building without it. And that shift, that quiet, brutal shift, was the first real blow, because it forced them to face something unbearable, the realization that they were no longer your center, that your life was no longer a reaction to their chaos. You weren't broken, you were breaking free. And freedom, to someone addicted to control, is the cruelest punishment of all. Psychologically, they depended on your instability. That's how they maintained dominance. As long as you were emotional, you were predictable. As long as you were in pain, they had leverage. But when your emotions dried up, when your wounds turned to armor, their power short-circuited. They didn't know how to manipulate peace, didn't know how to bait someone who no longer needed to win their affection. You unplugged from their matrix, and with one simple act, choosing not to respond, you dismantled the entire structure of their control. That wasn't a crack, that was a clean break. And from that moment on, they couldn't touch you. The beauty of your rise is that it was silent. While they performed victories, you were sculpting transformation. You were building a mind so sharp, so clear, that no insult could find purchase. They were playing checkers in the open. You were playing chess in the shadows. And when the board flipped, they had no clue where their king went. You weren't supposed to understand the rules, but you did. You studied the game, and then you stepped outside of it. Now they sit in the ashes of a system that once served them, wondering how the pawn they laughed at became the player who shattered their entire strategy. You're not angry. That's the part that scares them the most. You're calm, cold, calculated. Not out of malice, but out of evolution. They no longer recognize you, because the version of you they knew no longer exists. They played to provoke a breakdown, but instead, they triggered a breakthrough. They expected scars, but you returned with steel. And now, they find themselves fumbling for relevance, trying to re-enter a game that no longer exists. Develop awareness, logical thinking, being patient, and you will win at life in most things. They want you impulsive. They crave your reaction. The faster you move, the easier you are to predict. The more you speak, the easier you are to manipulate. But when you start pausing, when you let the silence stretch long enough for truth to expose itself, something inside you becomes lethal. Awareness begins when you stop giving people the benefit of the doubt and start giving yourself the benefit of observation. You learn to see the glitch in the smiles, the flicker of deceit in their concern. You begin to notice how patterns are hidden in praise, how pressure comes cloaked in care, and suddenly, you stop being a pawn in their emotional chessboard. You start reading their next move before they even know they've made it. That's the beginning of your power, when your awareness makes their entire performance useless. Most people are slaves to their triggers, and that's how they lose, over and over, fighting battles that only exist because someone else provoked them. But you begin to develop logic as your weapon, not emotion. When they insult, you don't react, you calculate. When they attack, you don't retaliate, you measure. Logical thinking turns your mind into a vault, unbreakable from the outside. You stop defending yourself because you realize truth does not scream. It observes. It waits. You move like a strategist now, not because you're detached, but because you've learned that pain expressed too soon becomes ammunition. You give nothing. You reveal nothing. You think 10 steps ahead, and they, still drunk on reaction, have already lost the game they think they're still playing. Patience is your final weapon, the deadliest one. Because in a world of dopamine junkies and emotional gamblers, the person who can wait, who can watch, who can delay gratification, becomes a god. They mock you for not responding. They think you're weak because you haven't clapped back. But you're not quiet out of fear. You're quiet because your vengeance requires timing. Your growth requires restraint. And that restraint, that still disciplined resistance to be pulled into the chaos, is what turns you into someone they can't touch. They lash out. You wait. They overplay. You strike. And when you strike, it's surgical. Not to hurt, but to remove. Remove your presence, your energy, your relevance from their petty theater. You don't need to win every argument. That's a child's game. You win in silence, in long-term precision. You learn to listen, not to respond, but to gather. You sit in rooms you once felt the urge to dominate, and you simply study. Every flinch, every contradiction, every insecure boast they think hides their desperation. Logical thinking breeds a new breed of power, subtle, methodical, and undisturbed. While they panic for validation, you build. While they flex for strangers, you evolve in solitude. You build a mind that doesn't beg to be understood, but demands to be respected, even in its silence. And that shift, that mental superiority, doesn't scream. It commands, quietly, permanently. Awareness cuts through illusion. You see them not as enemies, but as fragile creatures, trapped in cycles of self-sabotage. And that sight, that clarity, kills your need for revenge. You don't need to destroy them. They do it to themselves, eventually. You just remove yourself from the blast radius. That's what patience gives you. Safety, distance, time. You don't fight battles that collapse on their own. You just watch them decay. And you learn. You learn that every insult hurled at you is a confession, that every attempt to provoke you is a sign of insecurity. They wouldn't try to shake you if you weren't steady. They wouldn't try to drag you into drama if your presence didn't threaten their narrative. And that's the difference. You no longer fit into their script. You're rewriting your own. While they scream urgency, you breathe. While they sprint toward validation, you crawl toward mastery. Because you understand something they never will. Delayed power is compounded power. Patience isn't waiting. It's sharpening. It's the blade against the whetstone, the fire under the steel. You don't sit idle. You refine. And while the world measures success in claps and likes, you're building something more permanent. Reputation, depth, discipline. You don't explode. You evolve. And the ones who mocked your silence will find themselves suffocating under the weight of the person you've become. Not because you crushed them, but because they can no longer recognize you. You've ascended, and they were too busy performing to notice. Logic replaces chaos. Patience replaces desperation. Awareness replaces pain. And when these three combine, you become untouchable. You walk into rooms and no longer look for validation. You see, you feel, you dissect. Every situation, every person becomes a case study, not in judgment, but in understanding.